Most multinational supply chain companies have now set targets for reduced greenhouse gases. This would be the big players: JBS, Fonterra, Wilmar Sugar, Rabobank, National Australia Bank. They've all set targets. Yeah, it's a very important topic. I see that more as Coca-Cola for microbes. They chew it up within seconds and blow it out. What's the inherent productivity benefit of soil organic matter? It costs a lot of energy to make urea fertilizer. It costs a huge amount of energy to make glyphosate, which is strange. That soil carbon will just tick along with rainfall in the background. That the bigger you are, it doesn't mean to say you're more efficient. And so if emissions intensity is the target, actually the family farm is probably more likely to get a lower number than the multinational corporates.
Today I sit down with Professor Richard Eckard. He's named on the Reuters list of the world's 1,000 most influential climate scientists. He's a science advisor to the Victorian, Australian, New Zealand, Ireland, UK and EU governments. He's a member of the International Livestock Research Institute and the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation on Climate Change Adaptation. He also developed the first carbon accounting tools in Australia in 2001. Today I sit down with Richard and try and find out what the future for Australian farmers looks like with carbon under the spotlight. Richard, how are you? And thank you very much for being here today.
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, it's a very important topic.
From my understanding, it's a topic that's emerging to be game-changing for a number of industries, and yet it's something that we're perhaps not talking enough about. So it's very important to have you on the program today and get your input. Now, you've been researching soil carbon for quite some time now.
I sit more in the interface between policy and research in these areas. A lot of areas I've found we've done a lot of work on methane, on soil carbon, nitrous oxide, but more and more it's becoming important to sit in that interface between where industry's at, where industry targets are at, and where policy can come to the table and meet industry. So a lot of my work is about advising on how does soil carbon fit in the whole picture.
So we're certainly seeking your advice today, particularly from the point of view of a farmer. So let's start out with a really basic question and let's just set the ground rules straight. What is soil carbon and where does it come from very basically?
Yeah, soil carbon is the finer fractions of organic matter that are left behind in the soil when we have grown things. So most of soil carbon comes from roots that have gone into the soil and decayed. Some would say some of it is root exudates, in other words, sugars that leak out of the roots into the soil. I see that more as Coca-Cola for microbes. They chew it up within seconds and blow it out as CO2. So it's really more the organic fractions that go in as a result of good agriculture that can transition from something that might be low to something that might be higher as a result of better plant production.
And it's in everyone's interest as a farmer to build soil carbon because you're building fertility, and a lot of good farmers are already doing that, aren't they?
Yeah, so we've published some studies looking at what's the inherent productivity benefit of soil organic matter. And if you take a grazing property in Western Victoria with a low starting point or a high starting point under permanent pasture, you'll find there's about $200 worth of productivity benefit per hectare between a low starting point and a high starting point. What I mean by that is there's extra nitrogen that comes out of the soil as a result of a higher soil carbon. About 1% of the soil organic matter turns over as nitrogen every year, and that's a freebie. The other productivity gain is extra water holding capacity because high organic matter soils hold more water than low organic matter soils. So they hang on longer between rainfall events. So there's already $200 worth of productivity sitting there waiting for you to latch onto, not the least of which, once you've got higher soil organic matter, you are more sustainable long term.
When we look at adding inputs for increased productivity on a farm like fertiliser and diesel, I struggle to understand how we can become net sequesters of carbon in a farming system, because my understanding of the carbon cycle is that neutrality is sort of gained when you have optimum grazing, production, release, and then photosynthesis locking the carbon back up again. Is that a wrong way of thinking about this, or is that onto something?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the fertilizers have a pre-farm emission. So it costs a lot of energy to make urea fertilizer. It costs a huge amount of energy to make glyphosate, which is strange. Glyphosate is sort of based on nitrogen. So the more you use those, the more you inherit a pre-farm footprint. Then when you put them on the farm, the urea fertilizer produces nitrous oxide gas, which is, again, a greenhouse gas. So the more we go down that track, the harder it is to be neutral. There's good evidence that if you were in a stable system, that soil carbon will just tick along with rainfall in the background, that there is a happy medium of soil organic matter that forms as a result of your management. So if you're in well-managed rotational grazing, you will end up with, say, 4.5% soil carbon at Hamilton on a red soil in Western Victoria. That's what we've seen. And the variance around between 4 and 4.5% is just annual rainfall. So we've got a number of farms we've monitored over time that have gone through that transition from a low starting point where they might have taken over a degraded property with low soil organic matter, improved its productivity, taken it from 5 DSE to 20 DSE, improved the fertility, improved the species, and spent the next 20 years building soil carbon. The day of reckoning does come, though, because there's two examples I showed at Sheep Vention last week where 20 years later, they've reached the new maximum and they're just ticking along with rainfall. It's a good outcome because they've got 4.5% soil carbon. So let's not complain about it, but you can't build it indefinitely, as some groups would try to say you can.
How important then is it for farmers to hold on to their soil carbon credits? There's a number of actors out there who are seeking to assist farmers with the complex methodology of assessing soil carbon in exchange for 20, 30% even of the soil carbon credits of a property that they then sell on the market to polluters like the oil and gas industry. How important do you think it is at this early stage for farmers to hang on to every bit of carbon credit that they can achieve?
That's really important. I would say take financial advice on which way to go, because you might be able to get a few $1 million out of selling soil carbon, but you might find 20 years later that you're locked out of your own supply chain because you are a higher emission farm because you didn't keep them. I'll go back in history a little bit. We know now that after the Paris Climate Change Agreement, most multinational supply chain companies have now set targets for reduced greenhouse gases. This would be the big players: JBS, Fonterra, Wilmar Sugar, Rabobank, National Australia Bank. They've all set targets. If you think about it, the day they set those targets, they assumed an insetting model, not an offsetting model. What I mean by that is the worst thing that you can do for your bank and your supply chain is sell carbon credits outside of the family. Because the more you sell to the mining giant to help their problem, the less you socializing your low carbon number with your own supply chain to help them meet their target. Think of your supply chain as having a 30% target by 2030, and you're selling carbon credits to Woodside Petroleum, for example. The more you do that, the harder it is for them to ever achieve their target. So their target assumes that your farm will contribute or socialize or have a shared business venture with your supply chain to share your greenhouse gas emission target or your soil carbon with your supply chain in some business arrangement. That's called insetting. And that's why it would actually be the worst outcome for your agricultural sector to sell your carbon credits to the mining industry.
So the big message that's coming out of that seems to be that there's a lot of downward pressure on farmers to actually create carbon credits for the large multinational players and finance industry so that they can continue doing business.
It sounds like a very negative, but in actual fact, it requires us to sort of step back and say, well, how do they buy? What's the basis on which they can come to a farmer and buy product? They can't buy on actual emissions, because then they buy small farms only, because the small farms have less emissions than big farms, but that's ridiculous. So they can only buy per unit of live weight or per ton of grain or per ton of cotton, which is an emissions intensity metric. Then you start saying, well, how do you get to the front of the queue? How do you become the lowest number? How do you become a 10, not a 15, for example? And because the more they buy 10s, the less carbon credits they need if they buy 15s. The 15s are going to cost them 50% more carbon credits to get to their target. So there's an interest by your supply chain to preferentially deal with those farmers that can offer a lower carbon number.
Sorry, Richard. So by that, you're meaning farmers that use less inputs and increase their soil biology by good farming practices?
Well, it wouldn't emissions intensity doesn't require less inputs. Actually, it requires more efficient input output. So what we're saying is you've got a numerator that's greenhouse gases, but you've got a denominator that's tons of product. So if you just drop the inputs, you might drop the greenhouse gases, but you might not get more tons of product.
So that's
So
good news for
actually,
farmers that are intensively hungry, because if they increase their production, they'll actually be more carbon neutral.
correct. That's exactly right. So the more, so it's not about using less nitrogen, it's about using nitrogen more efficiently. It's not about less stocking rate, it's about higher live weight through the system. Because the higher the weaning rate, the difference between a 15 in beef production and a 10 is the 15 is usually a 60% weaning and the 10 is a 90% weaning. That's it. You've actually fiddled the denominator, not the numerator. You haven't changed the greenhouse gases. You've got the same number of animals, but you're just pushing more through more quickly as a result. So that's good news, because it really empowers farmers to say, well, your soil carbon can add to that, but actually just being the most efficient you can is the way you get to the head of the queue in that supply chain.
So that's going to make farmers look at genetics, selective breeding, stocking rates, all of those sorts of things in fresh light in order to comply with their carbon outputs.
Very much so. And then the soil carbon can just add to that balance and make it more attractive. So when you go to your supply chain and they say you're a 10 because you've got 95% weaning, or you're a 0.3 as a grain farmer because you only use 50 kilos of nitrogen, you can then add on to that to say, well, I've got 10 tons of soil carbon to knock that balance down to zero. So that's where your soil carbon comes in as an inset. But you've got to remember that it's not a zero-sum game for the farmers, because there's, first of all, the productivity benefit of being more efficient. But secondly, there's a counterfactual where that soil carbon has a value. You could go to a market and say, I could monetize it with an ACU, an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, and sell it to the mining giants at $35 a ton. Now the supply chain is saying, we want to keep it within the family. There's a shared business model straight away. And so what we're working on is a supply shared concept where it's not about carbon credits. It's just about everybody in the supply chain are putting into the farm is putting carbon credits or carbon units or carbon audits into the supply shed. The bank wants a slice of that. The supply chain wants a slice of it. Your first consultancy firm wants a slice of that low carbon number. And the outcome is shared between them in some shared business model. So it's not that the farmer gets zero reward.
Richard, I've had conversations with growers, particularly those with family farms that are already struggling under a weight of burden and a cost of compliance. Carbon reporting seems, from my outside view, to be incredibly complex and time consuming. Do you think that this could place extra further burden on the family farm and perhaps be aimed towards larger farms rather than small farms?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. There's no doubt that the larger corporate farms can afford to employ a sustainability manager to do all the management of the reporting requirements. I met with a bunch of them from the large pastoral companies yesterday, and I've met with those in the banking sector a few days before that. So there's no doubt that there are people spending their entire lives reporting on behalf of the large corporates. What we are doing for the family farm is coming up with more seamless ways of making this work. As in, I'll give you an example. One of the big wins we had was discovering that Dairybase, which is a database that 1,000 dairy farmers belong to, we discovered it asked all the questions to do a carbon audit for a dairy farm. And so we just buried the calculations behind Dairybase. And so whether you knew it or not, you got a carbon audit whenever you belong to Dairybase. That's how we need to progress in the future. So it's not additional burden of reporting. What we've done is taken all our greenhouse gas accounting tools, and through working with Agriculture Innovation Australia, have created an engine, not a tool. The engine is something that the Ruminati carbon accounting tool can talk to and get the right answer. It's AgriWeb could talk to it, AgWorld can talk to it, Ag360 can talk to it. So it's the whole new world where you've got an engine sitting there, and your farm might belong to a particular software provider that can talk directly to the engine, get your results, send it back to you, and you haven't had to do a carbon audit yourself. That's the plan.
So there is light at the end of the tunnel for small family farms. They're not faced with another juggernaut of compliance and regulation. There are actually platforms that are available for small costs that can help them achieve these goals.
What I'd be saying to the smaller firms is make sure you keep records, and that's just efficient farming anyway. So the days of not being able to keep records, those are gone. We need to move into a new era where if you want to be an efficient farmer, you need records anyway. And those records just so happen to be the same records needed for a carbon audit. And so you'll find a lot of the modern software coming out that's trying to make it really easy on your phone just to swipe right that you've moved sheep from this paddock to that paddock, swipe them and drop them in the new paddock. That has all the data needed to do your carbon audit for you. The Minister Watt in Toowoomba the other day announced that the Australian government will come up with this national standard for how carbon accounting should work. That was something we put to the minister, so you don't have this question of there's 5 tools out there, which one gives me the right answer? You just ask, is your tool compliant with the government standard, yes or no? Then the second thing government announced was that they would make a tool, an engine, free for farmers. In other words, you're not going to pay an extra amount of money for your software to talk to the engine and get the result back for you. So if you belong to any one of the major ag software companies, they'll be able to get the results for free and shouldn't charge you an extra fee for that.
So be very aware of bad actors that are out there that promise to give you a carbon map of your soils for 30% of your carbon credits that they then sell on the open market.
I would say if you're in that situation, go to the best practice guide for that type of thing, and you'll find that 30% is not considered ethical. There are a number of international frameworks that actually won't recognize carbon credits where an actor was taking 30% off the top. That's a bold statement, but it's something that's come up a few times, that there are guidelines around the world for what portion of carbon credits an actor can take as profit.
Where can people go for more information on this, Richard, if someone comes to them and makes bold claims and promises like that? What's the best place to go?
Look, we are working with most of the research corporations on best practice guides. The government's about to invest a lot of money with all the research corporations, GRDC, Dairy Australia, MLA. They will all have advice on this subject. I would also say go to your major commercial consultancy groups as well, because we've actually started putting them all through carbon accounting training. So your Nutrients, your Elders, your RMCGs, AgForce, they all are now fairly well across the subject, and would have at least a couple of staff in their ranks that know how to do a carbon audit, how to advise on carbon projects. See, we're in an era where we've got a misalignment of information, of expertise, where up until now, most of the expertise on advising on carbon are self-interested carbon salespeople. And just like you don't go to someone who's going to sell you an endowment policy to get a financial advice, you go to an independent advisor. We should be picking independent advisors from the major consultancy firms on carbon as well.
So people that already have credibility will have the tools to assist you before the carbon audit is required for trade.
Yeah. It was so we've put a few thousand people through our training course on carbon accounting, carbon neutral agriculture. How does it work? And continue to do so. But that training is now available through, say, Grain Growers Alliance, through Dairy Australia. There's multiple groups that are going to the next level of train the trainer in getting this information out to growers in formats that they can appreciate.
So ESGs came out of the World Economic Forum, and they've come from the Paris Accord, and now the Australian government is acting with academics like yourself and also growers' bodies to try and make it easy for people to comply and improve their farming practices.
Exactly. So we know all these ESGs, environment, social governance reporting requirements, are coming our way. We're in the carbon space at the moment. I would encourage farmers to think more broadly and say, just be aware that biodiversity is also there and water use efficiency is also there. It's not just carbon. So let's keep them all in balance. So don't do things for carbon that lock you out of biodiversity later on. Because we are seeing some skewed behaviors where people are planting trees in sheep pastures, pine trees in sheep pastures. That's great for carbon today, but it's useless for biodiversity tomorrow.
And in 20 or 30 years' time, those carbon credits won't be available anymore because the trees won't be sequestering carbon.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. The law of diminishing returns we saw very clearly in the Jigsaw Farms case study that we ran in Western Victoria. 20 years later, well, all your environmental plantings are maxed out because bottles only live for 20 years. And so you've now got a stock of carbon, but it's not changing every year and not sequestering and creating an offset. Soil carbon does the same. There's many groups out there saying you can build, endless soil carbon. You can't. That's the laws of nature don't allow that. The laws of nature say it'll go up to a certain amount and will level out that reflects your rainfall and your management. And that's it. You've got a stock, not a flux. You're not changing soil carbon. So it's a good thing to build soil carbon. It's a good thing to plant trees, but they're not going to be an offset on your greenhouse gas emissions indefinitely. They will have a role initially, but give it 20, 30 years, it'll no longer be sequestering carbon at that rate.
So focus instead on optimizing production from inputs and making your farming practices as sufficient as possible. Hold on to your carbon credits, and the message is you should be okay.
Yeah, that is a very sound message. I would suggest get to know your number as well. That's one thing we're telling farmers. Get someone to do a basic carbon account for you. Know what your sequestration number is, but more importantly, know what your sequestration potential is. In other words, have you maxed out already? If you're a long-term grazier, you've probably maxed out already because you've done a good job in the last 20 years. There's not a lot of room to improve. If you've got good grazing management, good fertility, or you're a minimum tillage cropper, you've probably got no room to move in changing soil carbon because you've got what you've got.
Now, one last question for you, and it's a bit of a broad question, Richard, and forgive me for asking it of you, but I'm a little bit confused. We seem to be equating 1 tonne of carbon sequestered by good farming practice with 1 tonne of carbon released by the fossil fuel and mining industry. Fossil fuel and mining industry is a million-year cycle. The agricultural carbon cycle's 20 to 30 years. Is that really a fair thing, or should it be a 3 to 1?
Yeah, good point. The thing is, once these gases are in the atmosphere, they all have some equivalence. What I mean by that, if it's carbon dioxide that comes from diesel on farm, it's no different to carbon dioxide that comes from diesel in the mining industry. So it really comes back to methane, whether methane is a long-lived or short-lived. Now, there has been this view that methane is a short-lived gas, and people have got mixed up between methane only lasts for 12 years. And that's the half-life of methane. That's the date when half of it's gone, not all of it. It actually lasts for more like 60 years. But the problem is that the methane, for the time it's in the atmosphere, has about 100 times the warming of carbon dioxide. And so there's a legacy effect that we miss when we say it's short-lived, because where does that extra heat go? The extra heat goes and stores in the deep ocean and will be coming out of the deep ocean for the next 400 years. So actually, when you really balance it all out, methane doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it comes from the mining industry or from agriculture. It has a long legacy effect that actually makes it as much warming as carbon dioxide. So in the end, having them on an equivalence basis is flawed. It's not the right way to do it, but it's the only way to do it to actually give it some equivalence. What started happening is the world has said, well, because there's this debate about agricultural gases versus non-agricultural gases, let's not use a multiplier to equivalate them, if that's not a word, but anyway.
I think we understand what it is. Let's just imagine that they're the same.
Yeah, but let's move away from that. Let's just set targets for them individually. And so what we've seen in response is, instead of trying to multiply methane by something to make it equivalent to carbon dioxide, the world has just said there's a global methane pledge. We want 30% less methane. We're not multiplying that by anything. You can't offset your way out of that. We just want 30% less. And Australia has signed up to that pledge. So that means the mining industry now has to figure out what it produces, because it doesn't know. You can't have a 30% reduction on something you don't know in the first place. We do have some idea of how many animals we've got, so we have a better handle on agricultural methane, but we just need to get the mining industry up to speed to figure out what their emissions are first before we can understand how much it's got to come down by.
Well, Richard, thank you very much
for your time today. I think you've given me perhaps a little bit more positivity around the future for small farmers, because that's something that I'm particularly passionate about. And I've seen an awful burden of compliance fall upon the shoulders of these heroic farmers with labour laws, with environmental compliance, and now with carbon compliance. It will be a huge relief to them if their local agronomist and their local software supplier can solve the problem for them, and they can continue to focus on optimising their production, which really is the way to reduce carbon in the agriculture industry.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And just as an encouragement to the farmers, I was associated with the Tasmanian dairy industry for a while, and the Tasmanian Dairy Industry Award of the Year only ever went to small family farms because they could actually be more efficient than the corporates. I'll get in big trouble with the corporates for saying this, but the bigger you are, it doesn't mean to say you're more efficient. And so
Yes.
if emissions intensity is the target, actually the family farm is probably more likely to get a lower number than the multinational corporates.
Well, that's going to be a relief to a number of viewers of this conversation, Richard. And I'm going to put a link in the description for more information on these topics. So thank you very much for providing that also. And guys, if you like this kind of stuff, don't forget there is another interview coming next week. Subscribe to the channel or you'll miss out. Richard, thank you for your time.
Okay. Thanks, Sue.